Hey everybody, welcome to another Rackspace Office Hours from Rackspace, the #1 managed cloud company. This is our weekly live video show that I myself, Alan Bush, and my co-host Drew Cox, we put this on every week, and it's just a great little way for us to interact with our customers and with people who are just interested in the cloud itself. And we try to bring on experts to talk about subjects and to learn a little bit more. And today we've got one of our DevOps engineers joining us remotely, Jim Rosser, and we're going to be talking a little bit about Chef, the configuration management tool. So, hey Jim, how you doing?
I'm doing all right. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're definitely glad to have you. Glad to have you joining us. For everybody that's watching, we've got, depending on which channel you're watching on, if you're watching us on Facebook and Periscope, we've got Jim hanging out here in this little monitor. But if you are watching on YouTube, Jim is going to be bouncing back and forth on that. But everybody should be able to hear him no matter what. And we should be able to have this conversation. I do want to mention that anybody that's watching, you can drop us a comment while we're going. We're just going to cover a little bit of the kind of basics of configuration management, how Chef fits into the ecosystem, and we'll be talking about that. But if you have a question or a comment, drop it to us in Facebook, YouTube, or Periscope, and we'd be happy to share that with the rest of the audience. But yeah, let's go in and let's go ahead and start talking about Chef. It's a configuration management tool. We talked quite a bit about configuration management last week, actually.
That's right.
In conjunction with our images episode. We're talking about not using images for a straight backup, but to actually use it to help with scaling out your architecture. And so we thought, hey, let's continue this conversation this week. So we're talking about that, and we brought in Jim because I know a little bit about Chef. You know a little bit about Chef. Jim knows a lot about Chef. So Jim, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and about how you work with Chef here at Rackspace?
Sure. So right now I work for the professional services team, specifically for our Fanatical AWS support. So our Chef stuff has actually winded down a lot in recent months, and for me personally. But I've worked with Chef for not only customers, for professional service engagements, but also for I ran operations back before Rackspace and used Chef for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us kind of some of the basic things that we can do with Chef, and what are some of the ways that we find ourselves using Chef?
I've seen Chef used and abused in very many ways that some I'm still boggled by. But the basics of it are basically you can build out infrastructure, you can build out your server and configure and do that. And then I've even seen Chef used to build out like the entire the infrastructure, the underlying infrastructure, so building out the servers, building out things like that. So I've even seen people bootstrap data centers with it.
There you go. That's that's the industrial strength use of Chef, I guess.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah.
So you mentioned you've kind of wound down your day-to-day or I guess heavy usage of Chef, and with automation tools, I think a lot of times that's it's one of the promises, right? Like if I start using this tool, I can use it to the point where I just don't have to fool with it anymore. It's all automated. It all just kind of runs itself. And there's some truth to that, but there's also a little bit of a falsehood to that. There is some ongoing management that has to happen. Why don't you talk a little bit about what that holy grail of not have to touch it anymore might look like, but then where that's just a bit of a pipe dream, and there's still going to be kind of ongoing maintenance that's required once your automation is set up and once you've leveraged Chef to the degree that you think is that Valhalla beautiful, perfect, and wonderful reality.
Sure. So Chef and configuration management in general help in a lot of ways. So the ability to be able to only do something once. So I write out a recipe, it installs Nginx and configures it and things like that. So I never have to do it again. Then my process for creating the same server or even a slightly different server is simply just bootstrapping it with that new recipe. Basically, when you're using configuration management heavily in like a sysad environment, basically what happens is you actually just kind of change your job. So your job goes from maintaining servers and logging in and like changing those things to actually just maintaining code. So it's definitely not something that you can just get up, drop a mic, walk away, and leave it for a year. There's always going to be constant updates. There's going to be new changes, especially if you're using community cookbooks and things like that. You're going to have to update to the latest. you're going to find bugs and all sorts of those things. But yeah, it basically kind of changes your job and starts to make you look more like a software developer than like a system administrator.
That's what we want to see a lot of times too, is treating your infrastructure like code. That's something we hear quite a bit, and it's not this permanent monolith that takes days or weeks or months to update and change. I mean, it's something that you can make changes to pretty much on the fly. So that's I would assume something that's been very beneficial to you when you were running operations before, but also to your customers as you were helping them with that.
Yeah. The big benefit out of using configuration management is generally I can do this thing in multiple places. So a huge one is being able to sync dev with like prod, or basically like a developer's workstation with a server. So those are like the huge wins, where I know that they're developing something on something that looks at least similar to what we actually have running in production.
That's certainly one of the places where the promise of DevOps looms pretty large, because there's that constant tension between, it worked on my laptop, it's your problem in production, that creates that tension between an ops group and a dev group. But when ops gets to take the initiative to build an environment that's going to look the same as production, and they get to take that on so that they're not being blamed for, I don't know, man, that's your operational problem, and it's more of a team and a collaborative environment, that can really yield some big results when it comes to just being efficient, being able to focus on the new and the growing instead of on the triage and the repair, because maintenance and triage isn't nearly as sexy as a new feature or something like that, and there's the requirement of doing some of that stuff, bug fixes on the dev side and just day-to-day maintenance. But once you're leveraging a tool like Chef, you're able to kind of extract that, how many servers do I have to go in and log into and update and maintain. You can do it in a much simpler, much broader way, a much more elegant solution than that sheer force of will and application of time that it has traditionally been. So when I spoke earlier about, I'm not going to have to do any of this work anymore, the work that you're doing is probably about the same. The end result is about the same. The way you do it and the elegance with which it can get done, and the sweat equity that's required is certainly reduced, which means that you can focus on more fine-tuning and more polish, as opposed to the brute force, I got to just buckle down and get all this stuff done before 2.0 launches, or so that I could take advantage of this new infrastructure, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so let's talk about some of the different reasons that somebody would want to use Chef as a configuration management tool, right? And there's a ton out there. Let's mention some of the others that we come into contact with a lot. I think Puppet's one that's been around for quite a while. Then you've got Ansible and SaltStack are kind of newer on the block. They each have their own strengths and benefits. It seems to me, and Jim, you can kind of chime in here and help me to get this right, but it seems like Ansible is more for setting up initially, and then Chef kind of has additional tools baked in that'll help you to get things set up, but then also to continue to manage it as the as your infrastructure and your development changes, right?
So Ansible has that ability as well. So Ansible is more of a push model, and I'm not super used to Ansible with the tower. So someone's probably screaming, "He's wrong."
Well, let us know. happy to bring that into the discussion.
But yeah, Ansible is more of a push model, so it's generally used. Basically, it's like SSHing into a system and running a bunch of things at once, getting that system ready, and then it's done. Ansible, unlike pretty much all of the other configuration management tools you've listed, does not check into a server asking for updates every 30 minutes or a day or however long you have it set. Whereas Puppet, Chef, and SaltStack, they all do that. So that's a big difference between Ansible and the others.
So what type of projects do you think work the best on Chef versus some of the others? Or what are some of like the key components that you would want to factor in when you're choosing which configuration management platform?
What items in a project differentiate that project in such a way that it's going to make more sense to use Chef than the other options?
So the biggest benefit and detractor of Chef is its pure code to start out with. So there was actually a talk given by Jamie Windsor a few ChefConfs ago, and he used an XKCD image that was perfect to describe it. It was essentially it's the MMO image. I don't know if you guys have seen it. I'll have to go look it up. But basically, it shows that Chef has an incredibly steep learning curve versus the other one. So, because if you look at it, Puppet has its own DSL, its own kind of like JSON-ish looking DSL, unless it's changed since the last time I used it. SaltStack uses YAML-based DSL, and Ansible uses YAML-based as well. So there's that thing. So right off the bat, like those guys, you're basically like you're still writing a configuration file. You're still doing things that especially system administrators are used to doing. They're writing out configuration files. Whereas Chef, I mean, you can pretend like it looks like a configuration file, because it kind of does. But in reality, really what you're doing is you're actually writing Ruby code to start. So there is a much larger learning curve for Chef in those senses, and even more so when you start diving into like the server architecture and things like that. It gets kind of complicated. But yeah, so if you're a Ruby shop off the bat, you're probably going to want to use something like Chef, because Ruby's not a scary thing for you. If you're pretty competent at programming in general, Chef might be the way to go, especially if you find yourself using tools and then modifying them a lot to add your own functionality, things like that. That's where Chef is good, because it doesn't hide that, and so up front it gives you all of that. But I mean, yeah, so it's really like, do you want to tackle the learning curve?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we found the learning curve. And we're able to.
Yep, that one.
Yeah, that's a good one. So we'll go ahead and share that. But yeah, I mean that is an issue sometimes, where you have to factor in the learning curve and what are you going to do and how long is it going to take you to make that change. Yeah, so sometimes you have to factor that in to figure all of that out. Great. So let me go ahead and take a real quick second to just welcome everybody that's watching, either on Facebook or Periscope or YouTube. This is Rackspace, the #1 managed cloud company, and we are doing our live office hours show. We do this every week. Drew and I come in and we just talk about some different things. Right now we're talking about Chef, right? Which is a configuration management platform that a lot of people have been using for quite a while as they build out their infrastructure. And it's something that we wanted to talk about this week, because we talked about configuration management quite a bit last week, actually, on our last show in relation to images. Also, next week is ChefConf, actually, in Austin, right? So just up the road from us here in San Antonio. Jim, are you up in Austin?
I'm not. I'm in San Antonio.
You're in San Antonio too. Okay, great. So, but yeah, it's there. It's
that's an easy shot though. You can get up there if you need to.
Yeah, depending on the traffic, it's anywhere from like an hour to
minutes to
6 days. Yeah, so it's quite the long commute sometimes. But yeah, it's out there. It's an option to go to. Jim, I don't know if you had any plans to go, but I know that we're gonna have a few rackers that are there.
Yeah, I won't be there, but there will be a few, and I believe Martin from my team is actually going.
Yeah, Martin Smith has been on our show a couple of times, and he'll be out there, and he'll probably report back for us, so we'll have some news to share, I'm sure, coming up here in a little bit. But yeah, we wanted to talk about Chef and some of the different reasons that people use Chef, some of the different ways that they use it. We've kind of already covered what Chef is, how it works, and things like that, but we can try to figure out a little bit more, I think. So. Let's see. What other scenarios did we want to talk about, Drew?
So I think, really based on last week's show, we wanted to talk about how you could stand something up quickly and how you could recover quickly. So, in case of emergency break glass, how do you take that scenario and recover from maybe a node going down or just an increase in traffic? So let's kind of start there, and then we can talk through some of the other added benefits and tools that can make the life of a DevOps shop a little bit easier. I'll go more targeted. How would someone use Chef not just to stand up an environment, but how would someone use Chef to recover from either overwhelming traffic? We can get to that one second. I'll end with this one. How do you use Chef to recover from maybe a node going down and getting back up to your original quorum of devices?
Chef probably couldn't recover you from a node going down. Usually if a node's going down, unless it's like a configuration change was made, someone shelled in and did it, Chef's the one that's usually the one controlling the configuration on the system. So yeah, usually node go down, I think immediately like the hypervisor has gone down. So what it can do is basically when you go in, you have this concept called cookbooks, and these cookbooks are basically like a module, and inside there's recipes that do different things. So when you have all of your infrastructure written into these recipes, what it allows you to do is it allows you to basically you can go in and bootstrap a new node, so you can either stand that node up with another CLI tool, like at Rackspace you'd use Rack, at AWS you'd use the AWS CLI tool, things like that. Stand that up and then actually just bootstrap it with Chef, which means putting on your client key and then having it connect to the server. So you can do that, and that makes it really easy because basically then your downtime is however long it takes for that Chef run to complete, assuming that Chef run is everything you need, and then your system is back up. And so you can actually automate that even further using things like autoscale. So you can have your autoscale set up in such a way that it will actually bootstrap the server for you, and then so your server goes down, new one comes up, and no problem.
So that's kind of what we talked about in abstract last week. We talked about the fact that everything eventually has to be run on some sort of infrastructure, even if it's obscure. And if a hypervisor does go down because hardware does fail, how do you get back up and running quickly? And so when we launched our public cloud, just building a pre-baked server from an image that you took of a complete device in the past was the way to do that. But now you can use the Rackspace pre-baked images, that's simple OS, and then pave on top of that with your specific requirements that you've identified in Chef to get that device in place as soon as possible. It's not going to necessarily go and log in and revive a physical machine, but it will be a part of the process that replaces a component in an environment. So a web server goes down because the hype has an issue or whatever the case may be, you can have, like you mentioned, have autoscale replace the component part, put another VM in place, and then do the work on top of that with Chef to quickly make that device identical to the others in the pool and ready to take load and get you back up to that original required state. The other situation is very, very similar, which is when traffic spikes and your requirements change. It's not because you don't have the resources that you intended to have at first. It's that your requirements have grown because people are showing up at a greater degree. And autoscale can play that same role. Instead of saying, I need to have this to have a quorum, I need 5 servers in this tier to be functional. If you go to 4, replace it for me. You can set up specific thresholds. So you can say, once traffic gets to this point, once CPU usage gets to this point, set those thresholds, add an additional device, and then you can build that same base server install and pave it with what needs to be there for that specific component to do its job. So you're still using your automation tools. You're using a few in concert to get you to that point. You're not just giving more horsepower to individual devices. You're adding additional devices and bringing them up to speed to what they need to be without automation. We've seen situations where people try to do that manually by hand, and there's so many spots where something could be different from one server to the next, and that's going to create user inconsistency. The user experience won't be the same. You'll start seeing all sorts of other strange things, and that's a bad day because you've spent a lot of time building your website or your application to do a specific thing and to serve a specific purpose. And if it's not doing that, then you're not differentiating yourself from anybody else, and you're tarnishing your brand. And so you want every single thing serving that purpose to look exactly the same. And it's not just in production. You want that in your QA, your dev, your other environments, so that you can have that trust that when the code changes, when you have a new version of that software or a new feature, it's consistent throughout. So let's kind of pivot and talk about that approach. So we've talked about additional resources to either replace or add to a pool. Let's talk about shifting from a code perspective, going from dev to test QA, whatever you're calling that phase, into production. How can you use Chef to make that process easier? And what are some best practices that kind of keep you from stubbing your toe on some of those typical issues?
So you can definitely use Chef to deploy applications. It's used a lot for that. In fact, there's cookbooks written down that, and there's even a resource, the Chef deploy resource, written for that. And we've actually done that for customers. So basically, the idea is you pull it out of Git, you pull an artifact out of S3 or something like that, and you deploy that down using Chef. Usually, in those cases, Chef is run using the server, using Chef like full on Chef. And so it'll usually check every 30 minutes. Sometimes we've had people who run, there's something called knife push, where it'll allow you to kind of run some orchestration commands. And so there's a few ways to kick it off, but essentially what it'll allow you to do is you can have Chef go through and run like all of the different steps needed to deploy the application. So check it out, or pull down the artifact, unpack it, install your dependencies, make sure everything's there, and then restart your service. So it's really nice to be able to do that. You can use things called attributes. And so you can specify on dev right now we're at version whatever, and so it's only whenever Chef runs, it's going to make sure it's using the version tagged in Git or wherever. And then so as you go through and test that in your dev, then you move on and you can bump that in your environment. And it also makes it kind of easy to roll back as well.
Well, that's super important, the ability to be able to roll back. I mean, that's one thing that we really want to be able to do is, hey, this is working 30 minutes ago, and then we made a change. Let's get back as quickly as we can.
I'd rather not be married to that broken new version.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Cool. Well, hey, I'm going to take another real quick minute to welcome everybody watching Office Hours from Rackspace, the #1 managed cloud company. I'm Alan Bush, and this is Drew Cox, and this is our weekly show that we do every week, and we talk to experts in the area of cloud computing. And this week, our expert is Jim Rosser, who is joining us remotely. He lives inside of this monitor, but we brought the monitor to. We brought the monitor to the studio today to join us. Jim's talking to us about Chef, right, and about the different ways that we're using Chef, a configuration management tool. We've talked a little bit about the ways that we, the reason that you would choose Chef over a different platform. We've talked a little bit about the upcoming ChefConf next week, but one thing that I want to talk about, and I want to encourage anybody that's watching live, if you have a question, to ask those as well. But one thing that I wanted to kind of discuss is how are we using this to work directly with our help our customers, right? So one of the things that we've been able to do is you mentioned you're in the professional services organization, working with our customers that we're supporting on AWS. What are some of the ways, Jim, that Chef specifically is used to help customers meet their goals?
So the big one we've been doing and seeing lately is actually not using Chef the server, but actually using Chef with Packer and building out images. So basically we'll build out their infrastructure with CloudFormation, and then we set it up in such a way that all you have to do is go update the AMI and run the CloudFormation, and it'll basically rotate that new AMI in. And so what we've been doing is we've been building Chef cookbooks and things like that and running Chef Solo using Packer. So basically automating the build of these AMIs, and then usually using some sort of SaaS CI or even Jenkins, something like that, to actually trigger a new build every time that happens, every time the code changes.
So let's kind of unpack all of that, pardon the pun. No, just kidding. Don't pardon that. So I haven't worked with Packer much, but it sounds like what you're doing is you're actually creating more images using Chef to automate the creation of a new image that has some of the specific features that you want to use.
Yeah, so we've seen it done two ways. One is doing everything, including the application deployment. So basically, the concept everyone's crazy about now is doing the Docker images, and I mean I just packed this application up into one thing. But basically doing that same sort of thing where you're building out the AMI with the application code, everything is ready to go. So basically you hit start on the your new server based off that image, and there you go, that application is running. And then we've also seen it where it'll partially or mostly bootstrap the image to the point where it is ready to accept an application, and then use another service like AWS Code Deploy to deploy it on top of that. But it's beneficial, and one of the things we were talking about earlier with recovering from an outage or recovering, the scaling thing. Sometimes a problem with Chef and really any configuration management tool is you have to wait for it to run. So I've seen Chef runs that have taken 30 minutes to run. So I mean, by that point, your scaling event might be over by the time your server is actually ready to be stood up. And so in these cases, it's actually beneficial to build out the image. You still have a way to rebuild that image multiple times. It's all in code, but you have these images that just come up really quickly.
Anything you can do to expedite your time to functionality is really, really huge. Like you mentioned, you may have a scaling event that passes by without you actually being able to get your environment up and running. And a lot of times that can come from people hitting the site or hitting the app and be like, nah, it's not working, I'm out. If you can get up to speed fast enough, then you're responsive enough to keep those potential customers or those potential users around long enough to actually make an impact and get that additional engagement. And that's a pretty big deal as well, especially when we live in a social media age where a tweet from somebody that has influence can be enough to get that immediate uptick, and you need to be able to take advantage of it.
And then it's done.
Yeah, it's a brief little flash in the pan, but if it's the kind of thing that cripples you because you haven't built a process fast enough, then these are tools that you can be using to put yourself kind of in the driver's seat in those situations. Have something on deck already that can jump in where it's needed, and that's a huge component to being ready to take advantage of those intermittent day-to-day small micro scaling events, or even just a really large one that may come out of the blue.
Well, it sounds like images are going to spin up faster than spinning up a blank image and then adding the configuration on top of that. So it seems like if you kind of front load that time, you do that before you have to spin up that next image, you're going to save a lot of time.
All that's in service of user experience. All
Right.
that's in service of making sure that the thing you spend so much time building is as useful and available as possible.
Right.
That's the business why behind that. Yeah, you want the image there quickly, but only to serve the business need.
Yep.
Yeah, and you can also not only just building server images, you can also use it to build Vagrant images or even Docker images if you'd like. So.
Oh, great. Yeah, and that makes sense. And I mean, it's something we've talked about again and again in this show is that when it's written in code and it's standardized that way, I mean, it's going to be the same way every single time, with that version control, with that history, so you can roll back if you need to and change it up. So yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to bring up, you mentioned in passing earlier about using a community cookbook or like that has upstream applications. How would you go about taking on something like that where you have dependencies that you may not control all of? How do you live in that environment in such a way that you're not putting yourself at the risk that it might bring in to the discussion? And when do you kind of make that decision, we're going to do this ourselves and own the whole thing end to end, versus maybe cheat a little bit on time to market, get to market a little bit faster, but have those dependencies? When you make the decision, and then if you decide to use something that has those upstream components, some community cookbook, how do you vet that and then maintain it?
It's really the same anytime you're using any sort of external library in software development. So the biggest thing is vetting the project to start out with. So if you go and find something that hasn't actually been updated or maintained in 2 years, then there's a good chance that it's probably going to be out of date and not work correctly.
That's always a concern.
Yeah.
I don't care if you're using a plugin for a CMS or what you're doing. Always keep an eye on how recently that's been involved an update or patch or anything along those lines. But I'll let you keep going. That's a broad recommendation.
Yeah, so that's always the first. Anytime I'm looking at a community cookbook, that's the first thing I do is I go look at their GitHub or if they're stored on Bitbucket, and I try and understand not only is this code being updated, does this code follow kind of the same pattern that I would do with my code? So is it up to my standards as far as how it's doing things? And then once you've determined that it's a cookbook you want to use, there's not a lot of danger in using it, especially if you're using the Chef server. You upload it to the Chef server. It's there. Back it up, but it's not going anywhere. So there's not a whole lot of danger in that. The only danger you have is if you're not paying attention and you're just upgrading these things willy-nilly, then you could end up with a problem. So yeah, 1 minute your Nginx works, and the other minute your node just crapped out.
Proceed with caution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and another thing you mentioned too, I want to bring this up, Jim, is that you mentioned that there are sometimes when you look at something and it might not be up to your standards. The great thing about a community cookbook is that you can make them up to your standards.
It's a starting point.
Yeah, exactly. It's a starting point, and you can either fork it and use it for your own good, or commit those changes, those improvements back upstream.
Yeah.
I know that's something that we've been pretty active in here at Rackspace. I know we use all sorts of components that. For orchestration within our public cloud, for managing environments, for deploying environments. So I know we're doing a lot to take our lessons learned and pass them back up into the community, which is something that if we're using community components, we want to also be contributing back to that community so that everyone is benefiting from what we're learning. I'm a huge fan. I just want to be sure that people who are using those tools know test, verify, all the things that we always say.
Yeah, and Chef especially, there's a large community around testing, and there's a tool called Test Kitchen. And so the biggest thing I would look for when you're looking at a cookbook is look to make sure that there's at least food critic linting, and Test Kitchen is set up in some way. So that's the easiest thing you can do is then clone down the repo or pull down the cookbook and then run Test Kitchen for yourself and watch it actually converge.
Yeah, that's definitely something to bake into your cycle of practices. Make sure that you're not just pushing stuff that you haven't vetted.
To bake in. Chef.
Is that a chef?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe.
Okay.
I don't know. Maybe you saute it in or something like that. Yeah.
You marry them.
Yes, exactly. All right. That's what, 2 or 3 puns we've had so far. All right, let's keep track.
We should really stop.
We won't though.
They've embraced puns, so we should. Follow suit.
We should too. So. Yeah, you didn't know what you signed up for, did you, Jim? But yeah, no, it's good. Well, let's also talk about some of the ways that we're working with Chef, internally. I know that we've used it to stand up some of our own infrastructure and to continue to maintain it. Do you have any insight into that, or is that something that you haven't had much experience with?
So it varies based on the team as to what tool they're using. So that's the biggest thing. I've seen people do everything. I heard of one group actually using Chef Solo with Ansible, I believe, and I've seen other groups using just the regular Chef server and that sort of thing. So it really varies, even internally, as to how they're using Chef.
Yeah, I think with many tools, we're seeing people who are comfortable in a specific technology bring that with them wherever they go, and they may be comfortable with Salt, and then they come to a team that's using Chef, and so then those two get blended in some way because you've got expertise on both sides. And really in deciding how you're going to go about your configuration management or your automation, prior experience can come a long way because it's the kind of thing that you bring ready-to-go skills to the table. When it comes to learning something, then you have to look a little bit more at what's the specific value I'm going to get out of adding this skill set or adding this tool set to my capacity. How can I get the most value? So what tool do I use? And one of the things that I really enjoy about the Rackspace, I guess, way of approaching things is we have a lot of people who have a lot of experience and their specific favorite tool that they use, which means we have a lot of hours of experience kind of on the breadth of configuration management options. So you may walk up to a group of desks and say, what do you use, and get 4 answers because you've got people who've got experience in all of those different things, and using them to help customers, using them to help Rackspace tools work better. So that sort of broad base of experience means that regardless what a customer's concern is, we likely have some experience in that realm and can bring that to bear and collaborate towards that preferred end result.
Yeah.
And that sounds like a professional services pitch, because we've got a lot of people with those experiences that can be leveraged in that professional services capacity, where you bring someone in who they've got the reps that your business would like to hire for, but either can't find or doesn't have time to go through the entire interview process.
Mm-hmm.
You can just get those resources quickly through our stable of experts to bring to bear on your specific issue.
Well, I would like to talk about that a little bit more, about the professional services side of things, since we've got an expert here with us. Can you talk about some of the different ways that we help our customers? I mean, is this all kind of like a front end? We're gonna, or the front side of things, we're gonna help you set things up, and then then you can run them, or what are some of the different ways that we perform professional services, especially around Chef?
So around Chef, for AWS specifically, so it's the team that I deal with. We do a lot of Chef to bake AMIs. We don't do much in the way of using the Chef server in the traditional sense, and we have actually used OpsWorks as well, which uses Chef. But those are generally the ways that we see customers wanting to use Chef, and even the reason they use it is because they use it already, or that's what they chose. They just blindly said, okay, let's do that. But there's multiple reasons for them to choose it, and so a lot of the what we do with that is, like I said, we bake AMIs, and we also help them build out their Vagrant environments and things like that as well. So that's a huge thing. Like I said, Packer earlier, so you can have a single Packer config that not only builds out an AMI, but can also build out a Vagrant box in the same way. And so they do that and then distribute out to their developers. What we do is customers will engage us. We'll talk. We'll basically go through the whole process. We'll give them a statement of objective. If they agree to that, a statement of work, and we'll do that work. And then what we do at the end is we turn that back over to them. And if they need us to engage later, then we can do that as well.
How often would you say you're joining forces with a group that's already using Chef, or you're joining forces with a group that's deciding to just get started with Chef, so they haven't the experience just yet, and you're part of the education process versus part of just the collaboration process?
So far, out of the deals that we've been doing, I think probably a large majority of them that involved existing configuration management had to do with Chef. So they already had Chef there, or they had already decided they wanted to use Chef, and they just wanted our expertise.
Cool. It would work both ways, but that just seems to be where most of it is headed, or has been.
Yeah, it's whatever they've decided they're comfortable with. I mean, we'll do, at the end of the day, we'll do Ansible, we'll do Salt, we'll do Puppet for them, but that seems to be the way it's gone, and especially I think Enterprise has adopted Chef in a big way over the last couple of years. It's seen, even if you go to ChefConf, like the talks have become more and more enterprisey.
Yeah, that does seem to be the trend.
Yeah.
Well, cool.
So ChefConf, that's next week. We've got a couple of rackers that are going to be up there. That's a good good opportunity if you're up at ChefConf. I know that we're going to have a little bit of a presence there, so stop in and say hi to us and ask some more questions in person. I know that's oftentimes a great way to do that.
At least half the fun of conferences.
Absolutely, the conversations that you can have, out in the hallway between sessions. I think, hey, I just heard this great thing in this session. What do you think about that? Lots of good conversation to be had there. So definitely want to give a plug for ChefConf next week. And if you're there, go ahead and give us a call, or give us a talk. We'd love to love to talk to you there. Drew, did you have anything else you wanted to make sure we covered?
I think we've covered what I intended to make sure we covered.
Jim, are we forgetting anything? I mean, like, you're the expert here. This is why we have you on here. What would you say to somebody that's thinking about getting started with Chef? I mean, what are some of the things that you would say? Hey, let's try this out to see if this is going to be the right fit for you.
Definitely, you should already be familiar with software development. You should already be comfortable and honestly want to do testing, because that's a huge thing in the Chef community. Be comfortable with Git. But on top of that, really, I would say the biggest thing is Chef, in its traditional sense, is using the Chef server and doing that. But there's lots of ways you can use Chef besides that. As we've already said, using baking images with Chef, and even and we talked about this a little bit earlier. Basically, you can use Chef solo, and that was actually a decision when I went through back in my ops days. When I went through, basically, we wanted our push button, like we wanted to build out the entire infrastructure without, at the push of a button. And so one of the things you have to take into account, especially when you're talking about a Chef server and things like that, is do you want to, is the Chef server the first thing you want to stand up, or is that something you want to stand up in parallel with other things? So, for instance, we had storage servers that we built out, and they were on bare metal, and so that we didn't want to have to build them out after, because we actually needed our storage first, and so we use Chef Solo for those kind of things.
Great.
So, basically use it in the workflow that makes best sense for you.
I'm going to ask a question around that. Okay. I imagine you're seeing a lot, since a lot of people are already using Chef that you're working with, I imagine that there's a couple of times that people have really shoehorned Chef into a place that it's not an ideal fit for, because it seemed like it at the time, but there's lots of problems once you take that step. Could you maybe highlight a couple places where it may seem advisable before you get into the weeds, but Chef really isn't the best place to be doing that specific job or that specific task, just to maybe steer people who maybe on the precipice of making that same decision away, and maybe give them a different tool that might be a better fit?
So I'm going to say Chef works really well at application deployment, but Chef also works really badly at application deployment.
Where's the differentiation when you come into a situation and you see they're doing it well? What differentiates that from someone who may have done it poorly?
So a lot of times we've seen maybe they have like a master branch or a production branch or something like that, and so usually when you do Chef application deployment, it's kind of like you just let the Chef's client run on the servers, and it just pulls the information, pulls the new code down. However, we've seen people that's literally what they did, and then they got upset because their application was deploying every time something new was in that branch. And what they really wanted was something that was a little more guarded. Mm-hmm. So we've seen that a lot, and there are ways to make that really slick in Chef. But it's also, I mean, if you want like a true deployment thing like that, it's going to be easier to use either knife push with Chef or use another tool for application deployment.
Well, very cool. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Anything we can do to warn people there be dragons? That's a good thing.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's not. We talk enthusiastically, I think, about a lot of different technologies, especially the newer ones. But we owe it to our listeners and to our viewers to have a bit of caution when that happens. I mean, there's not a single silver bullet out there. Nothing's going to be this panacea that's going to work for everything. And so a lot of considerations to make. So the more informed you can be, the better you're going to be in the long run. So. Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. Well, hey, on that note, I think we're just going to go ahead and wrap it up. This has been a really informative chat that we've had with Jim. Jim, I just want to say thank you very much for hanging out with us here for this last 45 minutes or so. Thanks for taking some time out of your day to join us. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Absolutely. So if you want to learn more about Chef, there's a couple of things you can do. You can check out chef.io. That's their website. And they've got that conference that we mentioned again. It's coming up here in a couple of days. But then also, if you want to talk about Chef here at Rackspace, just get in touch with your account manager, or if you're not a customer yet, you can go ahead and hit us up on our sales channels. And again, I mean, Jim, we're talking here about AWS a lot, and this is something that we're now able to do. We're now able to support customers across several different clouds. So, if you've got a workload that's split across multiple different cloud platforms, Amazon, Rackspace, Microsoft Azure, we can help you. So it's all there and ready to go. So, on that note, I think we'll say thanks for watching, everybody. Thanks for joining us on Facebook and Periscope and YouTube, and we'll see everybody next week.